Good afternoon. Can you hear me? So I'm Jean-Charles Rocher. I teach banking at the University of Geneva. And it's a real pleasure and honor for me to moderate this panel session on fintech and its implication for financial stability. So we have three distinguished speakers that cover a very wide range in terms of academia versus practice, and in terms of Europe versus America. So I don't think I have to introduce them. They have already been introduced by Jorge. So Christine is a professor of finance at Haas School of Business and Carnegie Mellon. She is well known for her work on microstructure, credit markets, and banking, and she currently works a lot on fintech and payment systems, and we already heard a presentation on cryptocurrencies. I think I will give the floor to her right now. I will introduce the other speakers later. So Christine, could you basically, so the topic, I should say a word of the topic of the panel, which is fintech. And as you know, the definition of fintech by the Financial Stability Board is, I quote, technologically enabled financial innovation that could result in new business model, application and processes or products with a material effect on financial markets and institutions, and the provision of financial services. So it's really a big question mark. What will be the impact on the structure of the financial industry, and what will be the impact on financial stability? And so the objective of this panel session is really to discuss the current state of fintech developments across the world, and also the current state of financial regulation of fintech. What are the challenges and opportunities implied by fintech, and what are the regulatory responses already taken and currently in the pipeline? So without further ado, I give the floor to Christine. You have about 20 minutes.
I might not take 20 minutes. Oh, we'll see. I think one of the reasons why everyone in San Francisco, so I live in San Francisco, is just incredibly excited about fintech is this possibility that it's going to make the world better. So costs are going to go down, people will have access to financial services, the unbanked will, become banked. Everything is sort of a bright new world. And I think there's obviously a huge technological changes are happening. Costs are going to be reduced. What I really worry about is, to some extent, we're completely unprepared, I would argue, for the onslaught of changes. So if you think about something like regulation, we have a myriad of regulations in place. So the US, for all its sort of free market discussions, is astoundingly regulated. So for example, if you transfer payments, you have to have a separate license in every single state in the US. I mean, there's little or no harmonization. It's just a patchwork of craziness. Be that as it may, in an ideal world, what regulators do is they basically identify an existing institution that potentially can do bad things. And the purpose of regulation, be it capital requirements, be it collateral, depending on survivor pay or bankrupt pay, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the world safer and make the system safer. And what fintech has the possibility of doing that I think we're not thinking through quite enough is it has the capacity to change existing structures and how they do business. And it also has the capacity to sort of introduce new structures. The regulatory frameworks that we have, I don't think are adequate to deal with both of them. So let me give you an example of the first one. So let's think about something like liquidity coverage ratios. Those are based on the idea that things come in and out of banks, and there are going to be flows, and so we want to make sure that there are enough assets. And basically, we're doing a coverage ratio that's based on what we think the average of, say, the past 30 days is. Then let's think about that bank that has apparently stable deposits, and they're stable in the sense that people pay into and take out of their banks for payments. Let's think about that specific bank that now has customers who decide to go to a fintech company. What's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is the distribution of essentially the payment flows in and out of the bank is going to change. So this is a project we've been working on. And is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends on how they change. So for example, if the safe part of the deposits, so the things that are closest to a normal distribution, get taken out by the small people who are now getting slightly cheaper services at the fintech, you're left with a bank that basically has a heavy tail distribution of things that look like payments going in and out. And suddenly the regulation that seems so sensible when it was devised in Basel might actually not be sensible, because those kinds of coverage ratios won't help an institution whose distribution of essentially liquidity shocks has changed dramatically. We just don't think through these problems. Another thing that I've been working on and I'm a bit concerned about is PSD2, which I'm sure all of you know, which is the second Payment Services Directive in the EU. It's sort of a step towards open banking. And it basically, there are lots of different provisions, and I'm sure I'm not going to tell you what they are because I'll get it wrong, but I'm sure you'll be detail. But one of the things that they do is they basically change the way in which people use their bank accounts for transaction services. For the people who are doing this, it's great because they're potentially getting cheaper payment services, which we want them to do, right? We think this is a friction. The thing that's not so good about it is the institution that previously was offering payment services now doesn't have as fine a granular information about an individual and essentially the cash flows that go in and out of their account. To put it another way, it basically means that that institution no longer has the soft information. Do we think that banks are benefited or they should have soft information about their clients? Well, it depends what we think the bundle of services is that a bank should provide. If banks provide loans to people, consumer loans, maybe we do want the people who process the payments to also have information that allow people to price more effectively, loans. And it's something that we just sort of don't think about. So the initial purpose of the regulation was basically to provide cheaper payment services to individuals, but the knock-on effect is going to be essentially it changes the distribution of information in the economy. Might be a good thing, but we're not quite sure. Might be a bad thing. And I think people who are interested in regulation tend to be a little bit paranoid, and I think we should all sort of just be getting a bit nervous about that. The last thing, the other thing that I think is sort of really important to think about is not that fintech is changing the current institution, so that's sort of the discussion we just had, but also that fintech is leading to completely new institutions. So I think we don't know how to deal with a media company or any sort of large entity that, in addition to its existing services, finds that it can also provide payments, right? So, for example, we have things like Facebook, Google. We know them through sort of social media applications, and they've sort of started to realize that there's a very, very natural extension of their business model, which is to provide more services. For the people who traveled in China, the WeChat hegemony is actually very, very scary, right? They know everything about you. They know your friends. They know where you shop. They know where you're, they just know everything. They can see your chats. They probably read your chats. And this is a private company, and it's super efficient. for an individual, it's just great. It's all on one phone. It's all nice. It's a good format, and it's got a cute logo. It's like a little thing. It's nice. But we don't quite know as regulators how to deal with it. Right? This is something that I think everyone collectively should just think really, really hard about. How do we want to think about competition in this new world? How do we want to think about information? Who owns it? How do we want to distribute it? And these are things that I think are just completely up in the air. And they have to be sorted through, and very quickly, because it's happening right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next speaker is Santiago Fernandez de Lis, who also we already heard him. He's currently the head of financial system and regulation at BBVA Research, and he has a large experience in both the private sector and the public sector. He was the director of the international department at the FI, a consultancy and think tank. He was also at the Bank of Spain for quite some time, and head of monetary and financial division and the director of the international department. He also worked at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, and he's also an academic. He's published several papers. He teaches at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and also at Carlos III. So, Santiago, we would like to hear you about the current situation, especially in Europe. What do you think the picture is, and how is it evolving? So you have, 20 minutes if you need, or less.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I think things are changing very rapidly, and I agree with Christine that this is a very exciting process, and it's basically positive in the sense that it's driven by basically consumers' wishes. And this is something that is happening in other sectors and is happening also in banking. So I think in financial services in general. So first, about banks, fintech, and big tech. I think we are moving towards a much richer ecosystem in which different players are interacting in different forms. There is cooperation, there is partnership, there is competition, and the key question here is who retains the relation with the customer, who has the access to data, and who has the trust of the customer so that they can exploit a virtuous circle between consent, say trust, consent, data, and providing insight and value-added services. This is so different players are trying to exploit this advantage, and we will see what type of animals are the ones that really do better. Fintech in general are trying to unbundle financial services, whereas banks are trying to rebundle them, and this is a very interesting kind of struggle. And next, I think we are moving towards this idea of ecosystem in which different players are forming partnerships in different areas. Fintech are focusing on origination and sales and are taking part of the value chain of banks. According to McKinsey numbers, this area where they are focusing is 65% of profits of banks and has a return on equity of 20%, so much higher. They are attacking the most profitable parts of the bank's value chain. And then competition. Yes, you refer to competition. I think we are moving towards a world in which competition is being played in a different playing field. Now, competition, we used to have a focus on competition that was sectoral and national. And now competition is cross-sectoral and cross-border. And this is one first thing that we need to change. For instance, in Europe, the European Commission is an institution that has a strong mandate on competition because originally this was their remit. But But now they need to change the way they approach competition. Now they need to have this kind of cross-sectoral view and also looking at cross-country dimensions. And it is interesting here to realize that there is no international body in charge of these things. No, I think this is a message that I think is important for regulators to understand. Because you have the G20, you have the Financial Stability Board, the IMF, the OECD, different forums and country groupings, but nobody has a mandate that integrates financial stability and with things like data protection, privacy, competition, or cybersecurity. So it is interesting to see there are some recent reports by international organizations on the reform of the international financial architecture. To mention just two, the IMF World Bank Bali FinTech Agenda, presented in the Bali annual meetings a month ago, or a bit more, and the so-called Eminent Persons Group report, which was commissioned by the G20. None of them refers to this issue. No? I mean, this is very interesting. They make a lot of concrete recommendations, some of them very sensible, but they don't focus on this. How should we approach regulation? I don't know. I mean, there are some keys to that. One is activities-based regulation instead of institutions-based. No unnecessary barriers to competition, and in the particular case of financial regulation, well-defined perimeter of prudential regulation. So when banks are entering, for instance, into a fintech world, or they are engaging in cooperation with new players, the regulatory perimeter imposes a very heavy burden on parts of the activity that are not core and are important to develop new capabilities. So for instance, we are facing some restrictions here when we enter into cooperate the agenda of the regulators. I mentioned this question of the cross-country dimension. I put you an example because the technology we are talking about is inherently cross-border. But as I say, the approach to regulation is national. To put you an example, we asked some years ago to the Spanish authorities, AML authorities, for a permission to do digital onboarding of new clients. So it was using a video conference. You have procedures of identification, and they were very strong, even stronger than physical identification. We showed it to them, but well, finally they say, well, listen, yeah, but we don't like it, it's not secure, so we were not allowed. And then we learned that a German neobank was opening accounts in Spain using this same technology from Germany, using a video call with the permission of the German AML authority. And then, well, when we came back to the Spanish AML authorities, and then we got the permission. But this is the type of pressure that national authorities are facing. This is a very important part in the European debate. Is the combination of two regulation environment in the world, but the combination of the two create an regulatory asymmetry, because it creates a very uneven situation. Because if, for instance, Apple or Google decides to enter the payments industry, which they are already doing, they can become a third-party provider in the EU, have access to bank accounts with this standardized real-time format, but banks couldn't have the same access to Google data. No? So this is an issue that is already creating regulatory asymmetries. Data, well, I mean, of course it's clear that data should empower the customers. The customers should be the owners of the data, and they should have the capacity to allow or not access to their data. To me, I think they should not be forced to accept data sale in exchange of services, this is a delicate issue, and it's ethics related to data. I think it's a very important aspect. But for instance, in the US, after the Facebook scandal, there was a debate on whether to adopt something similar to GDPR, And actually, California passed legislation that was slightly different. I think it was, if I understood correctly, but maybe Christine, you know better. In the EU case, you have a kind of an opt-in for giving the consent. In California, you have an opt-out. So by default, you have access to the data. Let me say a word about data is very much related to cloud. And again, cloud computing is another important element in all this, because cloud computing is not longer an option for financial institutions. It's a necessity. You cannot really compute the data we have now without the cloud. There are cybersecurity concerns in the part of some supervisors, but when I talk to our engineering people, what they say is, listen, we cannot never reach the levels of security of the Amazon Web Services or the like. They are much better than any of us in that. So cybersecurity is actually something that is in favor of cloud, not against. And in this regard, regulation, again, the challenge for regulators is to move from the present approach that considers cloud as an outsourcing. So cloud is like any type of outsourcing. An outsourcing regulation is very demanding and very restrictive in some legislations. I think in the limit, cloud should be treated not as outsourcing, but as a utility. To me, cloud is like access to electricity or water supply. I mean, in the limit, I think this is the vision we should have. Couple of words on sandboxes. Now, there is a lot of discussion on sandboxes, and I think this is a useful instrument. There has been a lot of hype maybe around sandboxes and maybe too much expectations. Now, if you read at the experience of the countries that started first, like the UK or Singapore, well, I mean, it's a success, but it's a success limited. Now, I think it's very important to identify well the entrance, the exit strategy, and but I think as a mutual learning process of dialogue between regulators and the industry and new entrants, I think is very positive. But it's also an instrument that should be used for new entrants. Again, here there is a cross-border dimension, and there are some discussions now about whether to create something like a cross-border sandbox. It's an initiative by the UK authorities, which I think is interesting. Well, cryptocurrencies, sorry, just one word. I mean, we have some restrictions in the use of cryptocurrencies for experiments that I think should be relaxed, because now in Europe we have an EBA, European Banking Authority opinion that basically, in practical terms, prohibits banks from doing anything with cryptocurrencies. And I think there is some experimentation in the context of sandboxes that could be useful. So I think, but of course, in terms of investor protection, I don't think there's much room for regulators there, because I see the cryptocurrencies world rather as a casino, and I don't think the role of regulators is to protect people that put their money in a casino. But it should be clear where is the limit of protection of depositors or investors in regulated markets. And finally, I think if we think in terms of the objectives of financial regulation, all these things are very much affecting the different objectives of regulation, which are, well, efficiency, financial stability, consumer protection, and integrity. The problem here is that the impact of these objectives is not symmetrical. No, I think all these changes are clearly improving efficiency. There are probably more risks than positive on financial stability. And as regards consumer protection, well, there are question marks here too. Also, I think that putting the consumer at the center of all this, empowering the consumer in the end, is going to be positive for them. So the better consumer protection is to make sure that the products are adapted to the consumer preferences. But here, of course, all this is changing the balance of objectives of the authorities, and they need to rebalance all this. And final word on banks. Well, for banks, I think the main challenge here is the cultural transformation that requires all this new world. I mean, banks are very old-fashioned institutions, and they need to change, they need to adapt, they need to transform themselves into much more flexible and agile organizations. And this is a big threat. No, I think we can compare this to the dinosaurs, no, that finally evolved into birds. So the good news is that, well, they managed to do this transformation. Bad news is it took 50 million years, no? So maybe banks don't have so much time, but they need to do a similar transformation, which is certainly challenging.
Okay, thank you very much, Santiago. So the next speaker doesn't need an introduction. He's Jorge Ponce. Is the organizer of this conference, but he's also the head of the Financial Stability Department at the Central Bank. And he teaches at the Universidad de la República and Universidad de Montevideo. And he holds a PhD in economics from a very good school in France. And is currently working. He's currently working on digital currency and fintech development. So, Jorge, can you give us your point of view of the situation in Latin America in particular?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I will do things different a little bit. First of all, I have a PowerPoint presentation. Second, I need to do the usual disclaimer. What I will say is my opinion and not the opinion of the institution to which I am affiliated. And to start with, I think that many points on my presentation have been already discussed by Christine and Santiago. We face more or less the same challenge and the same opportunities regardless of the region in which we are. As Jean-Charles said at the beginning, fintech stands in short for the application of technology to finance. And this is something as whole as the introduction of the deposit contract by the Middle Age, or the introduction of ATM machines in the 20th century. So what is different now? And I guess there are three things that make this wave of innovation different from past ones, and in these features will be the main challenge and the main opportunities. The first one, you refer to it, is velocity. This is a high-speed process of innovation and introduction of innovation. High speed is quick, very quick. Second one is worldwide. It's not restricted to an area, but is everywhere. And this make two things related to financial stability. One thing is maybe more interconnection in finance, but also in system, in process, etc. Or a common trend. Two things which are at least to care about if we think about financial stability concern. And the third feature is highly demanded by customers. Is a demand side looking for better customer experiences. And all these features of the current financial innovation imply big opportunities and big challenges. For all stakeholders in the financial system, it becomes particularly relevant to maintain the balance between the increasing inefficiency in pleased customers on the one hand, and to keep risk under control in the other hand. But of course, these features, in particular velocity, worldwide, interconnectedness, etc., implies that coordination problems, externalities, and systemic risk become more important. So a challenge is to solve the trade-off efficiency risk. And another challenge associated with it is how to do it. maybe we need new instruments, new forms, new timing on doing regulation, doing things, new technologies for a sound and safe financial innovation. So in order to inform all these developments and taking the point of view of a regulator of the financial system, we think that it's important to take a stock of fintech issues in order to have a clear picture of what is going on. That is what we did actually with the help of CEMBLA, the Center for Latin American Monetary Studies, which is a group of central banks. So we conduct a survey in Latin American and Caribbean countries, and I will show you the preliminary results of this survey, which were conducted just in August, and now we are processing all this data. So the survey was put to central banks, to authorities, and was completed by 18 central banks in question regarding the importance and opportunities of fintechs, question regarding the challenge and risks, but also regulatory issues and possible solutions about that. But we also asked the private sector about this, and the private sector, not only incumbent institutions like banks, but also new entrants, commonly called fintechs or well, new entrants, about the same kind of questions. And we got 78 questions from an initial 176 forms distributed. First thing, respondents said that fintechs are important. Are important due to financial inclusion, competition in the market, and efficiency. Although the relative order differs, and the order of importance of the respondents seems to reflect the declared concern of each of the parties. For example, the authorities have a concern about financial inclusion and think that fintech is important because of financial inclusion things. Incumbents talk mostly about cost reduction, efficiency in the way in which they are processing things. And new entrants talk mostly about new business models and transforming the financial sector, things that you, Christine, talked at the beginning. About dimension and implications, well, currently, fintech is important, but it will become, according to the responses, more important. Currently, almost 60% of the countries agree that the agenda of fintech is important, but 94% fully agree that it will be more important in the future. 71% are fully agreed that fintechs will bring benefits in innovation, competition, financial inclusion, but also in growth at the end of the day, and market completeness. And there is a big potential. 70% sees a possible disruption caused by fintech. And this disruption could be an impact on the traditional business model of banking and other financial markets. And another interesting thing is that, of course, fintechs, according to the respondent, have opportunities, benefits, but also risks. 53% of the respondents fully agree that fintechs will bring new risks. But of course, in the balance, at least 71% opportunity, 53% risk, well, the balance seems to be positive, at least in this comparison in Latin America and the Caribbean. About the impact and leadership, well, the industry and the authorities share the perception that the new entrants and the incumbents are leading the incorporation of technology, although the new entrants are still small in terms of market share related to banks and also to something that you mentioned, which are big tech like Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., etc. So new entrants are relatively small leading the introduction of innovation and with a disruptive potential. But incumbents are also introducing technology due to cost reduction, maybe increasing competition, and also the demand for new products and new services. And of course, there is at least a concern. You mentioned Santiago and today during the other presentations also about the muscle of big techs. They have capital, they have information, and they are few, so maybe this is a real challenge, not only to new entrants, but for the entire financial system. About risks and policy issues, well, cybersecurity and data protection and privacy are the concern of all of the stakeholders. Nevertheless, risk perceptions is likely differ. For example, authorities care more about data privacy, cybersecurity, anti-money laundering, and fraud. But incumbents and new entrants care mostly about cybersecurity, data protection, and incumbents in particular about operational risk and legal risks. One interesting thing is that incumbents and new entrants declare or mention at least that they are taking steps into controlling the risk. For example, through risk management, through compliance, through partnership, and these are ongoing responses to the different risks. To address the risk, the policy agenda of authorities has various priorities. At the top is ensuring proportionality in regulation and risk management, similar risks, similar regulation, and also all the stuff of cybersecurity, data protection. And when you compare this with the response by the industry thinks that the current regulation in the regional list adequately covers data protection, conduct of business, and anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism. So there is some agreement in the responses. And another interesting thing of the responses of the most relevant policy issue is the order. Address similar risk is at the top, cybersecurity is at the top, but innovation under a safe and sound principles, which is another way of regulating, issuing principles, and the level playing field is not at the top. Is in the menu of authorities, but no, is not the most important, at least the most important declare things. Another interesting thing is about non-regulatory barriers. I don't know if you can see, but there is the response by incumbents and by new entrants. And there are pretty different things. For incumbents, some kind of rigidity, and I think, Santiago, you mentioned that, that might have implications to incorporating technology. For example, internal barriers, the staff lacking the required skill, some kind of funding, lack of knowledge, are at the top of the non-regulatory barriers. But for the new entrants, are some kind of market frictions, imperfections that act as barriers to enter the market, and maybe this requires further public intervention, or at least there is a rationale for that if there is a market failure or some kind of lack of access to essential infrastructures, anti-competitive practice, and so on and so forth. And both of these things has implications to financial stability. Of course, competition is important, but also it's important the things that are declared by incumbent, because if in this rapid process incumbent banks are back on innovation due to these internal restrictions, could be a threat for financial stability given the cybersecurity issues and all the stuff you even mentioned, Santiago. About regulatory barriers, Well, at the top is the time needed for legislation to adopt or to adapt to the new business models, to the new developments. After that, the regulation that does not allow the adaptation of technology, regulation is not clear or does not provide enough certainty, and things like that. It's important to say that different jurisdictions are taking steps in this sense. Maybe is needed another form, another way to regulate, another way to think the problems and to incorporate regulation, etc., but authorities are taking a step on that. For example, here, the Central Bank of Uruguay and the Superintendency of Financial Services has clear mandates which balance the soundness and solvency, the risk part of the business, with the efficiency and the development, has mechanism to coordinate, could be always improved, but there are institutional mechanisms to coordinate and care a lot about the proportionality of being a functional approach to regulation, being clear and being timely. Authorities also find some kind of barriers, like, for example, the lack of mandate and coordination, what, well, we at least here in Uruguay try to solve and have solved in the charter of the central bank. The sectorial approach could be a barrier, but it is still the most used approach, and the functional approach or by activity approach is considered better, but in some cases authorities are unable to introduce it due to legal constraints. Interestingly, sandboxes do not rank high in their perceived usefulness to enable fintech and innovation, and Santiago told us something about that. Is the functional regulation, the advice, and maybe innovation hubs what are perceived coordination stuff, which is perceived as the most powerful tools in order to balance innovation and control risks. Regarding the role of authorities, well, of course, central banks and banking supervision authorities are perceived as the most relevant ones, but there are other agencies perceived here as relevant, sometimes telecom, sometimes the treasury, sometimes data protection agencies. And this poses a special challenge to the design of the institutional arrangement for fintech. This is very important. Coordination and a clear assignment of responsibilities becomes crucial, and maybe the way in which we solve macroprudential issues through coordination in financial stability committees could be a way in arranging the institutional things to foster financial innovation in a safe order. So, on top of monitoring the activities, cooperation and coordination, distribution of oversight responsibilities, the institutional arrangements, interoperability things, and it's nice to listen to the experience of Europe about PSD2 and GDPR, because these things could help interoperability, but of course we need to take care of other things. And also cross-border coordination are important things. Remember that this is a worldwide phenomena. Possible solutions from the authorities' perspective, well, international cooperation in the regulatory framework and in cybersecurity. As Santiago said, there is not international body for fintech, but, well, there are room for that. Tool to stimulate innovation, mainly innovation hubs. Regulatory approach, mainly functional than sectorial. Internal coordination aspects, internal the regulator central banks, it's important to have a cross-department effort, but not necessarily a fintech department. It's important to coordinate, to share views, to share information from different disciplines, but not necessarily to concentrate authority in a single department in Central Bank of Regulator. That is what the majority of the central bank in the region think. And about technical knowledge, of course, we need training and more human resources. In general, central bank said we know about the issues, but we need more muscle in order to attend the problems. From the private sector perspective, well, regulatory framework is on the top of the thing. Also, sandboxes, accelerator hubs, financial literacy and interoperability for new entrants, and investment in innovation, cooperation, and training for incumbents. And ongoing response, I already talked about the risk management, compliance, and so on and so forth. So, challenge ahead, a lot of things. I guess from the survey, it appears evident that cybersecurity is one big issue to take into account. Interoperability, open systems is another issue, of course, to foster innovation and introduction of new entrants. But, of course, you have to take into account that it also poses risks due to the interconnection, and this should be clearly balanced, and it's not an easy thing. Customer protection and data protection, and maybe also enhance customer rights, and enhance regulation and supervision. I guess these are the 4 points to work out in order to promote a sound and safe financial innovation with welfare improving effects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorge. So I must say that before participating in this panel, I was very optimistic. I thought that fintech would give an improvement in the allocation of resources, in the management of risks and everything, because of better technologies, better management of data, and more competition. But I'm very pessimistic after hearing you, because I have the impression that the GAFAs are already taken over, and that it's impossible to regulate because of many, limitation in the regulatory process, and the regulators are always fighting the previous war. So I would like to hear you, in particular Christine and Santiago. Do you think the battle is already lost for regulators? Or do you think, for example, Christine, you said that the PSD2, you implied that it was not a very good regulation. Is that what you have in mind? Or do you think there is some hope that it might work?
So I think with regulation, it always depends what you think the objective was. So I think with PSD2, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, the purpose was just to reduce costs for consumers and to make it a better experience. And the thought wasn't really what the knock-on effects are, and for me, the knock-on effects are they change the distribution of information in the economy. Banks use the information in a way that sometimes help consumers. Potentially, if you look at a longer horizon, it's going to be a problem. The other thing with the issues around security around information in the EU. Let's suppose that I find the most secure way of holding people's data and transferring it is to use a commercial cloud service. And I'm being prudent by doing that. Jean-Charles is also being prudent by doing the same thing. And then we suddenly find out that instead of having concentration in the banking sector or banks that are too big to fail, we have a cloud service or a data processor or an information owner who is too big to fail. And I think we can solve these problems, but it just requires us to understand what the problem is and to identify it. So I don't want to be negative, I just want to be paranoid.
If I may ask Santiago, you said technology has no borders, but the problem is that regulators are basically domestic, or in the best case scenario, they coordinate in the Basel Committee or in the Financial Service, the Stability Board. But do you believe they will be able to coordinate in an effective way?
Well, good question. I think, first of all, I think I'm optimistic. I think all these changes are good for consumers. So I think that what we are moving towards a world in which there will be a wider offer of products, probably more affordable and more choice. So I think all these things will empower consumers, and this is good, certainly for all of us. So I think, but on the technology, well, I think the coordination, I think regulators are used to coordinate in forums like, say, the Basel Committee, the FSB, with a very specific purpose, which is financial stability, and in the origin of all this is related to international banking, but it's a very limited approach. What we need now, and I think Jorge explained it very, very well, is to put together authorities that normally don't talk to each other. So, I mean, I was in a central bank 20 years, and I never talked to a data protection authority. I was not even aware that there was one. So I think now all these things really are moving regulators towards a new environment. So they need to coordinate internally, which is already difficult, and cross-border, which is much more difficult. So I'm not optimistic in this regard. But I think I'm optimistic in the sense that there is awareness of this problem, and the question is who should take the initiative. Probably the G20 has the advantage of having relatively high political standing that can put together different authorities, because in the end, well, the top guys are there, not they just met in Buenos Aires. So I hope the G20 would start moving in this direction, and they can certainly put together different authorities of different countries. What the extent of the agreement, the agreements they can reach? Well, there, quite frankly, I'm not that optimistic in the sense that to talk about basically three big players, Europe, the US, and China, have no common views and no common objectives in many of these issues. So if we think about what is the common denominator of these three on things related to payments, data protection, cybersecurity, not to talk about Russia, I mean, then probably the common denominator is very small, if anything. So yes, I mean, it's going to be a difficult process, but I think we need to start. So I hope that there is some initiative in the G20, or I don't know, maybe the IMF is also moving in this regard, but the IMF, I think, does not have the political mandate for this. So I don't know. I mean, I think, but the issue is there, and I think it should be addressed soon, better than later, because the pressure. And there's one thing, I mentioned this example of this German neobank and the story of digital onboarding in Spain. Well, this shows that sometimes harmonization is the result of the pressure of regulatory arbitrage. So, well, the authorities will move sooner or later. They will. It's better that they move, if you want, in a proactive manner and cooperating ex ante. But if not, I think the pressure of the technological changes will make them move, and there would be a certain degree of harmonization de facto. But then there will be tensions, there will be competition. So I think it's better to do this in a cooperative manner, I guess.
And finally, I would like to ask Jorge if he thinks that from his survey, the results of his survey, that there is really a hope of collaboration, coordination between Latin American authorities, given in particular the situation of Uruguay, which is in between two big countries that have currently big problems, and not only on the financial stability aspects, but other aspects. So are you optimistic?
Yeah, when you said pessimistic, sorry if I transmit this impression, but no, it's not pessimistic. I guess there are good reasons to be optimistic about the financial innovation, and this, as Santiago said, Christine also, is on behalf of customers, is for the good. But I would say not pessimistic, but aware of the downsides. And as financial regulators, as prudential authorities, we need to be prudent. And so we need to focus on the good stuff, but also in the potential disruptive, in the bad sense, things, in the potential risks and the downside of the things. Many of the developments could be really good, but some of them could have some risks. So it's important in this battle that I agree regulators generally go far behind the problems. Well, one thing is to learn from that lesson and try to catch up and try to learn and try to think and to see and to think what is going on, which kind of technology, which kind of business models, opportunities, risks, and this is an important thing, and we are in that thing. So the second important thing, I guess, is to provide a level playing field in order for the market to express, and well, if the developments are good for customers, are demanded, and the risk is under control, is the best that can happen. So provide this playing level field and also control risks is important things. And care about non-intended consequences of the regulation. Because it's the Lucas critique, every time you change a regulation, you change completely the game, so you have to take care of that. And that is a reason, not an excuse, but maybe a reason for regulators to go parsimonious, in the sense that, well, don't act too quick, but to understand the problem first, and, well, given the moment, to put the regulation they think is the best one. Regarding your last question, yes, we have a very good understanding with different regulators in the region. This survey comes from the experience of a joint group of central banks in the region, with a common concern about the issues of fintech and cyber currencies and digital money, and with the common concern about, well, to learn from each other about experiences and about what is going on in different regions, different countries. Well, this is a forum for that. And of course, there are other forums in which regulators, in particular BAB regulators in other countries, interact. So in that regard, in the region at least, the collaboration is free, is very good in some sense. And also with other bodies like, well, Basel, or even with Spain. Here in Uruguay there are a couple of big banks, one is yours, from Spain, and well, there are a good understanding and a good collaboration in this regard.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the discussion, the general discussion. So I believe there is a microphone somewhere. And so identify yourself, or maybe briefly identify yourself for those of you who are well known. So, yes, Gerardo.
I'm Fernando Simet, apparently.
No, you don't have, go ahead.
Two questions.
To whom?
To the panel. So fintechs are related to innovation. So the phenomenon of fintech is related to innovation. And Jorge has said that we need to strike a balance between the risks and the opportunities that this generates. But the mandates of the central bank are very concise, in which the central banks should be concerned with the financial stability and price stability. So there's no explicit mandate on growth or the externalities that can derive from innovation in this type of industry. So are we prepared to generate this right balance? Should mandates of the central banks be modified, or should the law try to generate an environment outside the mandate of the central bank to foster innovation in general, not in fintech, probably through sandboxes of some sort? This is one question, and I forgot the second one.
So let's start with the first one. So who wants to respond?
If I may, I think, I mean, you're right, but in a way there is an implicit mandate for efficiency, and innovation is related to efficiency. So you put it other way, I mean, if you put all the emphasis on stability and nothing on efficiency, in the long term, you are going to have problems. So if banks don't innovate, sooner or later, they will not be viable. So in this new environment, I think if you look long term, you need to also care about how banks improve their efficiency. And this requires innovating, adapting to this new competition. So you cannot just focus on stability, no? It's like, I don't know, speed in a highway, okay? You want to make sure that there will be nobody dying in a car accident. Yes, you can put a limit on 20 kilometers per hour, but, well, it will take very long to go to point A to point B. So you need to strike a balance there. And I think implicit, there is a mandate for efficiency also in financial stability, because in the long term, both are correlated.
But if I may extend the question, and I really agree with her that this notion of changing the mandate of the central bank is really important from the point of view of the accountability of the central bank to the general population. Central banks are doing things that they were not doing before. Are they right in doing that? And also, if you think of the privacy question, the management of private data, for example, it's clearly a thing that it's broader, much broader than financial stability. It's a question of democracy or freedom and stuff like that. So who is in charge of these questions? There is no regulator. I believe that there is no clear institutional framework for managing these things. So I don't see how this can be solved. Is it the central bank is going to manage everything in the end if you start in this type of things, right? So what do you think, Christine, for example? Should the mandate of central banks be reformed, or?
I would say no. I would say that there are a series of political discussions that we haven't had, that we have to have, and we have to have them very soon. So the discussion about who owns data, I mean, to some extent, data is behind a lot of the innovations. It's behind the sort of issues of natural monopoly. It's behind these sort of big problems. But how do we want to think about data? So let's suppose that you have some extremely embarrassing medical condition and you want to keep it private. We'd all say, yes, you should be able to keep it private. But what happens if I take your data and I join it to somebody else's and I find a cure for a 4-year-old? Do you still own that if there's an externality in your data? And all the big data machine learning basically is about looking at patterns or correlations. Another way of saying that is about essentially finding externalities between my privacy and basically things that might be useful economically. And this is a political question. Where do we feel comfortable with the boundaries, where the boundaries are? And I don't think central bankers, as innovative as they might be, can handle that. I mean, this is a political and it's a moral question. And might even be too much for economists, I don't know, but it could potentially be. But I think it's a question we have to have. It's a discussion we have to have.
Okay, thank you.
Keeping aside the very important question of the unelected power, which is central bank or other authorities, which is a relevant question for democracy, I guess that I agree with Santiago that if the central bank mandate has soundness of the financial system, solvency of the financial system, development and efficiency of the financial system as an objective, this is enough, and this is good for doing things.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Please.
Yeah, so I wanted to revisit this old debate on financial stability versus competition. So I'm wondering how this debate is now reshaped by fintech, and whether we should expect a lot of consolidation in the banking industry, a lot of exit due to previous business models not working so well anymore, and whether we should think about the regulatory response also in terms of banking regulation.
You mean the trade-off between competition and financial stability?
Competition and financial stability. So there is this idea that too much competition can reduce potentially financial stability. And for instance, it could lead to risk-taking behavior, for instance, and related issues. And also in a way, the buffers of banks against losses is lower if the profitability of the business model is reduced.
Profitability of the banks, I don't know. I really don't know. It's an important issue, of course, even without fintech. They think about competition. In the one hand, you have some guys explain that monopolistic banks are safer than full competition, but on the other hand, there are other effects depending on the asymmetric of information problems that are behind. So I think the market is going to a new equilibrium. So as a regulator, we need to take care about these issues, about the issue of financial stability in the first place, not necessarily to protect the profitability of some enterprises, not incumbent, no new entrants, but to take care about the stability of the system. And competition in two senses. Competition because of lack of competition, that is bad, and in particular when you need interoperability and open systems. And competition on the other part if it's too much competition. I don't see, at least at the moment in Uruguay, a scenario of too much competition.
I just want to make one small point, which is we think about innovation happening and then affecting the system, and then we might want to regulate it. I think it's useful just to remember that a lot of innovation occurs because of regulation. So there are frictions in place. People are viewed as either getting rents, or people figure out a way of getting around the regulation. So financial innovation, a lot of the sort of, say, security design, this came about because of regulation. If you think about, say, high-frequency traders, which was sort of the first fintechy thing that came along, these came about because of regulation. The US government said, we're going to foster competition, so we're going to have lots of different competing marketplaces because that's going to be better. The minute you have competing marketplaces, it makes sense to have algorithms. The minute you have algorithms, you get high-frequency traders, and it just blew up. But that came from a well-intentioned regulatory push to foster competition. Paranoia.
But you want to say something?
One point here. No, I think this is a very good question, and it's true that not all the authorities have the same balance between financial stability and competition. For instance, in Europe, I think the UK authorities in the recent period have put in very much emphasis on competition, going far beyond PSD2 with all the open banking standard, and they think they know what they are doing, but of course they are putting pressure on banks, and when you put pressure on banks, well, there will be casualties. I think this is something that you have to accept. I mean, like in any other transformation, there will be some institutions that will be able to adapt and others that will not. So you need, yes, to take into account this and to prepare yourself to deal with these institutions that will not be able to adapt. I think we are doing a lot in the banking resolution area, where we are trying to design a framework in which banks may fail without contagion to other banks or to the economy as a whole. Well, this is a very important objective, no? So creditors absorb losses and not taxpayers, and this is also very important. But yes, I think there will be casualties.
But if I may add to this question, and use your metaphor of the dinosaurs. So the idea was the fintech would be small mammals going to replace the big banks, the big dinosaurs. But what I understand is that it's the big platforms, the GAFAs, that are going to replace the banks. So it's not so much the small, efficient people who are going to act, but there is an issue of the market power of this big institution. So how can you deal with that at the world level? I mean, I have the impression the battle is already lost to some extent, no?
Question.
Very good question, yeah.
Excellent question.
Catherine?
Well, I don't know what you would do, but you know, given what happened to Facebook, I'm not so sure I would open an account at Facebook. So it's not that clear that the battle is lost for, it's just that we were talking about data privacy and what consumers would like to have. And I think on this point, traditional banks could have an advantage to play, like committing not to use data in an excessive and undesirable way for consumers. So I can hear the fact that with regulatory arbitrage, maybe the competition is not on a level playing field. But on the other hand, I see some advantages of incumbents vis-a-vis these newcomers. And is it me who I'm just too optimistic? Or, I mean, Jorge, you had these surveys on do fintechs see this sector as super easy to enter and you know, what type of answers did you get from your surveys and from these potential entrants?
In fact, the small business find it hard to enter due to non-regulatory barriers, non-access to the infrastructures or other things, and this is repeated all over. But they also care about the big techs, about Google, Amazon, etc., because they see and they ask the same question to Shanshar about, well, the potential, the muscle of these enterprises that are big, with a lot of capital and a lot of information, and even more information given the PSD2, as Santiago said. So this is a concern, a big concern. How to tame these enterprises? Well, I guess, and correct me if I am wrong, in other aspects, Europe, for example, are taking big steps on that, on competition things. Putting some fees and things to Google because of some kind of time, Amazon, Microsoft. In competition policy, they have charged one and again these big techs. This is the reality for Europe. I don't know the reality on the US. Big techs here in the region are not so important yet. And of course, our muscle is not the same that the US or the European Commission to tame these big elephants. It's an open question.
Christine?
So there was recently a story in the newspapers that actually disappeared quite quickly, and you couldn't really Google it. And essentially, Google in the US, Google and MasterCard came to an agreement. So you're at home and you basically Google fluffy slippers. Then you go to a brick and mortar and you buy fluffy slippers with your MasterCard. They share information. And basically, the reason why Google wants to do this is because it can say, well, look, you clicked on fluffy slippers and you bought them elsewhere. But I think there are obviously efficiency benefits from this, but I think there's also issues of just extreme snoopiness. I'm not sure if that's a technical term. And I think it would be very difficult to think of anyone being able to compete with somebody who knows that much about your purchasing patterns and power. Just wait.
Santiago?
I think your question over the battle is lost. Well, as I say, I mean, I'm not pessimistic on this, but on the Google tax, the last news I got from Europe is that apparently European countries are backtracking on this. So, and taxation is a very important issue here. We don't know, I mean, we have a taxation, international taxation that is not really adapted to this new environment. We don't know the value of data, and that's why we don't know how to tax these things. I mean, so of course there are competition issues, but not only, also in the area of taxation and others. So I think it's, and then you question about the advantage of incumbents. Well, I think I used to think that the advantage was trust. You have the trust of the people that put the money in your bank. And actually, there was a discussion this morning about trust and mistrust of banks. But a very interesting thing I see in surveys is that people, you ask, do you trust the banks in general? The banks get a very low scale at the level of serial killers, more or less. No? But if you ask, do you trust your bank to put your money, then the rating is much higher. So still, people trust banks to manage their money. But of course, these things are changing. For instance, I think there was a big change the day we gave Apple our credit card. Well, that was, if you look back some years ago, well, I wouldn't give my credit card to, I mean, a fintech company in the Silicon Valley or so. But now we do it and we are used to it, and so these things are changing. So that's why I think trust is so important, no, in all this process, because this allows you to have consent, data, and with that all the value added.
Okay, so there is time for a last question, if any. So it's been a long day. I would like to thank the panelists. Okay, thank you very much.